A couple of guys have asked me to do a short video on my waste oil-fired furnace. It runs on used car oil or diesel, amongst other fuels, just my petrol. The furnace is designed for an A4 crucible that has wheels so that it can be packed away when not in use, and the lid is a cam-operated lifting mechanism that lifts the lid off the furnace slightly and then swings it to the side. The flow areas around the crucible are important for efficient burning, and this needed to be designed correctly. To help with the design of the furnace, thermal simulations were done to ensure primary and secondary combustion. You'll notice the combustion tube runs slightly cooler than the rest of the lining. This is to make sure the fuel is automized in the tube and primary combustion takes place at the bottom of the furnace and not in the tube. This is to prevent the tube from becoming blocked. Even though the tube runs slightly colder than the rest of the lining, it does eventually burn through and needs to be replaced. I found with my furnace this is typically between 10 and 15 heats. If the furnace runs clean and efficient, there should be very little smoke. This is a clip of the furnace starting up, and you'll notice no unburned volatiles coming from the exhaust, which is a good indication that the furnace is burning most of the fuel, even when cold. I can melt anything from the aluminiums to the bronzes, and even cast iron in my little furnace. The foundry tongs and pouring ring are all made from scrap rebar. Even the sand comes from my local river. One of the few things I do buy for my foundry work is the crucibles. And this is one of my cheaper ceramic crucibles that I use for my foundry work. Here's a recent brass casting for a safety valve cover, polished up nicely. Copper is one of the more difficult things to cast, with gas the biggest problem. Then of course, cast iron can be tricky with hard spots and casting inclusions, some of the common failures. Looks like these came out okay. Alright, so let's very quickly walk through a typical casting process. You'll notice that I put all of the material that I do want to cast on top of my furnace, and that typically heats it up and it gets rid of all the moisture in these sort of things that I want to cast. Depending on what I'm casting, the additives get added either halfway through the melt or at the end of the melt. Typically, if you're melting brass and coppers and stuff like that, you add a reductant halfway through, and then you carry on feeding on top of the sort of reductant as you go. Once the melt is hot enough, I typically use something called a sounding bar in industry, and all it is a 6mm bar. I dip it into the melt, and then when I pull it out, you can actually see whether the melt is ready to pour. In theory, it should be about 50 degrees C above your melting point, but if you have a look at this bar, you'll see the top, the slag froze, but the bottom, the metal has melted onto the bar. You'll also notice that my pouring ring, the thing that I used to hold the crucible with, is preheated at the top of the furnace. So that gets heated and then placed down onto the refractories when I'm ready to cast. Now here's a good trick. Before skimming the furnace, I clean the top edge of the crucible with a piece of wood. Now that reduces, and it's much easier to strip the slag off of the side of the crucible, and it makes skimming a whole lot easier. My skimming tool is really just a stainless steel dessert spoon welded onto a 6mm bar, and they last typically a couple of casts. Then after skimming, I take the crucible out, put it on the casting ring, and I pour into my molds. Now you notice when I pour into my molds, I pour at a steady pouring rate. I don't have a wave going into the molds, and it's just an easy pour. Then you know that you're getting the gas out of your mold uniformly. Once I've poured, the crucible goes back into the furnace, and I typically don't allow it to stand outside of the furnace for that long. The problem is you can get your crucibles cracking. I also add a carbon on top of my risers, and you'll see the smoke coming off, and that's just so that I can use my risers at a later stage for other machining purposes.
This is the first test drive of the lowered foot pegs. So I made these lowered foot pegs the other day, and this is the first time I'm going to get to test them. And I also raised the bars. So this is the first test run, so let's see how it goes. That's my girl. So the original bars were a little bit forward, and they were a lot further down. And the problem is, I would literally drive up this road and my hands would be absolutely finished. The thing is, I'm not a very tall guy, so the idea was to raise the bars a little bit, just change the position so my seating position was slightly different. The thing is, a lot of the guys that have Blackbirds have that problem. So there were two major things that I changed other than raising them. So I moved them a little bit back, and the center line of the handles are in line with the center line of the shocks. Where previously they were ahead and further down. So they were cast using an old mag wheel that I melted on my furnace. So they're pretty strong. The handlebar risers had some interesting machining that was needed, because other than changing the riding position, I also changed the angle of the handles. The original Blackbird had The original Blackbird had handles that went down at quite an angle, and that was also giving the far end of my palms sort of towards this side horrible pains. So I changed the angle from 9 to 3 degrees, and that's also made a nice difference. I'm specifically riding without gloves. I normally never ride without gloves, because I actually want to feel how rough the handles are without any gloves, because the gloves have got a certain amount of padding. So anyway, the machining was quite interesting, because there's two different angles that I needed to machine. There's the center machining with the splitting for the clamping nut, and then the angle for the bars. Yep, I think this has done a world of good. My hips aren't sore, my hands aren't sore, and I tell you what, if I was driving around like this with old handles, I would not be a happy chappy. Let's turn this bike into an absolute pleasure. And of course, this is driving without any gloves on. Probably some of the roughest roads in Joburg.